Okay, I think in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get going. We'll get copies, members, of the substitute for House Bill 143, of which there's extremely minor changes. So I'd hope to do that one first, but it's not here yet, so we'll just work with what we have. We'll go ahead and take a look at the subcommittee substitute of House Bill 142. That's LC 256167S. That committee staff should have, I know, has distributed. What I think I'll do is just address the changes specifically, of which there are not many, candidly. We've taken a lot of time and tried to tighten up the bill and clarify certain sections of the bill based on gaps that were self-discovered and gaps, frankly, that were pointed out to us in the public testimony of the hearing last week. And that's, again, as we all know, part of the legislative process. I will tell you that in the event that the subcommittee recommends a due pass to the full committee, that will not occur until sometime next week at a time to be determined. That will allow members of the committee, the General Assembly, and of course the public, first and foremost, to digest the subcommittee substitute, and for us to take another step back, take another look at it, and reserve the right to be educated further about provisions that may need to be looked at again. And we're going to welcome those suggestions as we go along in the next few days, heading into the full committee next week. That's the way. That's the process that we've conducted up until this point. And that's not going to change. And of course, we'll get Chairman Meadows. I know we'll get that notice out as soon as he's able. What I'll do, members of the committee, is just talk to the specific changes that we have. Again, there are not many, but they do clarify and I think make what was already a very strong bill even stronger. The first change I'd point out is on line 66. There was a question regarding subcommittees in situations where you have House, Senate, or committee functions. Those are functions, as we all know, that generally happen perhaps once a year. Committee functions may happen once a year. They may not happen at all. It really depends on who the chair is. But there was a line in there regarding subcommittees. It wasn't really defined clearly, so we decided to propose for your consideration standing subcommittees of such standing committees, and also local delegations of the House and Senate as defined by House and Senate rules. That's on line 66 and 67. A lot of times what we have, and I think we've all experienced this in our constituencies at home, is that we'll have certain county chamber functions, certain functions with local professional groups. I'm from Cobb County, the Cobb County Medical Society, the Cobb County Independent Insurance Agents. Usually, if not uniformly, we'll have some sort of legislative briefing function, usually a luncheon, usually right before the session, so that we can hear from them about what's on their mind. It's a delegation-wide event. Again, these things, in my experience anyway, subject to being educated by another member here, they happen once a year. And what we found as we went ahead and looked at all this is that these particular expenditures that we're looking at are really once a year events, for lack of a better term. They're not, these ongoing expenditures. They're one-time, what I'll call one-time expenditures, mostly, if not uniformly, especially as it relates to committees and delegations. We tightened up on in section F of that same page, lines 83 to 90. We took a couple of sections and just consolidated them to make them more readable, hopefully more understandable in this regards. Travel would still be permitted. Of course, it's all disclosable by that entity that may be paying for the travel. The individual, and this is for the member, individual transportation, travel, lodging, and registration for attending educational, informational, or civic meetings, functions, or conferences that directly relate to the official's duties of that public officer or the office of that public officer, etc. So, in that situation, it's meant specifically for conferences, meetings, again, things that happen once a year, usually outside the session. It does include individual travel, lodging, and registration for those programs. If, in fact, an entity wants to go ahead and pay for that, that, of course, again, as always, is required to be disclosed on a lobbyist disclosure. The last section that got a lot of attention and that we paid attention to very closely was, of course, the who is a lobbyist. Looking at the next page, on the top of page 4. The intent, as enunciated by the author from the very outset, was to make sure that the individual is here representing an organization on an ongoing basis, that individual would register as a lobbyist. Anytime you're representing yourself as representing an organization and attempting to influence the actions of a public officer, that individual is lobbying. And that's a good thing, and it's protected under the First Amendment. We just like to know, as other lobbyists have to register and let us know who they represent on a particular issue, that will apply to everyone. There are some caveats in that I'll go ahead and speak to you directly, or exceptions, I should say. If you look at, but just to be clear, on the top of page 4, any natural person who, paid or unpaid, who is representing an organization, a position, agenda on behalf of an organization or business entity for the purpose of influencing the decision of making such public officer, of moving a public officer on a position, should register as a lobbyist. However, and that will include reporting requirements as well. However, what we didn't want to do, as we talked about this at the last meeting, is we have many days here at the legislature, as we know, that we have citizens come down as part of groups. I pointed to the Nurses Association as one really good example. They were here a couple weeks ago, and there are hundreds of people in white coats on the second floor of the second and third floor of the Capitol. Absolutely, positively, the intent is not to go ahead and have all of those individuals register as lobbyists. That would be an absurdity. So what we did is we put in an exception that if an individual is lobbying on behalf of an organization, and these are in the exceptions, and that begins on the on line 272 on the bottom of page 8. And there will be an amendment that will play into this after we take a motion on this. But if an individual is here lobbying on behalf of an organization, they have to register. However, if they are lobbying on behalf of an organization and they are unpaid, like the individuals at Nurses Day, for instance, or Dental Day, or whatever it may be, those individuals, if they are here for 5 days or less, do not have to register as lobbyists, and there are no requirements that go along with that. If they are paid, they do have to register no matter how many days that they're here. And I think I don't have to explain that. That sort of goes without saying. Making expenditures, they'll go ahead and file the required disclosure reports, but they'll file a bunch of zeros, right? Because there won't be any kind of filing. There won't be any kind of filing expenditures that they'll be making. So that is generally, the bill and the substitute. There are not extensive changes, but there are important changes that clarify, tighten, and I think the best work that was done really was on clarifying who is a lobbyist and making sure that we have folks register who should register, but making sure that we don't have any de facto unintended consequences that come along with that. I'll be happy to answer any questions if I can. I'm not going to hesitate to go ahead and ask legislative counsel and or the Speaker's Council for help in case there's any question. Mr. Ramsey.
Just if you could clarify on that there was some consideration of bifurcating the fee for compensated lobbyists versus non-compensated lobbyists. Could you just describe for the members of the committee why we couldn't go down that road from a case law standpoint, Mr. Chairman?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Ramsey. There was a case back in 1995 where there was a differentiation between I'll call it types of lobbyists for lack of a better description, and certain lobbyists were paid one fee and certain lobbyists were paid another fee. That gets us into the potentially dangerous realm of equal protection, where you're charging one set of citizens a particular fee in order to do something, as opposed to another group, which is another fee. We felt, out of an abundance of caution, the proper path would be to go ahead and reduce that to make it uniform across the board to $25, which is really an administrative fee. But we didn't want to get into the question of, well, these folks are volunteer, therefore they should pay less. These folks are being compensated, they should pay more. They're both petitioning their government pursuant to the First Amendment. That gets us into a dicey business from a constitutional perspective. And candidly, that was it was I think a very circumspect decision by the Speaker to simply, let's not go down that road. Let's do the right thing and just reduce that fee so it's level, even, and low. Mr. Lindsay.
To also clarify, although we're not talking about HB 143 yet, we have also in 143, since you did talk about folks who are down here pro bono who are not making expenditures, I believe in House Bill 143 we have language that allows an individual who's down here pro bono who has not made any expenditures in the previous year and who will sign an affidavit stating they make no plans of making any expenditures in the coming year, will only have to file one affidavit at the beginning of the year to that effect, and will not have to make any of the other quarterly reports that folks are otherwise have to make. You know, Organization A sends a volunteer down here. They're down here all the time. Yes, they gotta register as a lobbyist, but as long as they haven't made expenditures in the past and they swear they're not intending to make those in the future, they can sign an affidavit with the Ethics Commission, and that's the only thing they have to do for the coming year. In other words, we're not looking to make people jump through artificial hoops if they're not making expenditures. But that'll something I believe will come up in 143.
Well, let's hold that for one.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, since that got raised a moment ago, didn't want to confuse folks.
Okay. Mr. Renner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple questions.
Sure.
That perhaps you could just clarify for me. On line 65 and 66, where you talk about standing committees, you know, some of the committees I serve on do not have standing committees. So does that mean that the committees will go back and form standing committees?
I think this is possible. Any standing committee in the House can always form standing subcommittees. I know that there are a fair number that do and have historically for as long as I can remember. I know on my own committee and my predecessor, who also had two subcommittees and has for a long time, and usually they're subject matter based. It'll depend on the committee. There are some committees that lend themselves to having standing subcommittees because the jurisdiction that they have is pretty broad, and some standing committees, you know, won't, simply because there's no need to. That really comes down to the discretion of the chair.
Can I ask my other questions?
Sure,
All
of
of
course.
them now. So if a standing, so what is a standing committee then?
A standing committee are those committees that you see in the House rules, and they're listed out alphabetically,
Okay.
everything from appropriations to Ways and Means, agriculture to
All
Ways
right,
and
well,
Means.
maybe what I'm asking about is standing subcommittees then.
Standing subcommittees are established by individual committees. For instance, in my own committee, we have two standing subcommittees. One is Crimes Against Persons, Property, and Public Administration. The other standing that's chaired by Chairman Ramsey. The other subcommittee is Crimes Against Children, Narcotics, and then I have a general category.
I think that's really what I wanted to say, is that some of the standing committees I'm on do not have standing subcommittees.
Right.
And that's where I'm trying to figure out, does that mean you're going to go back and, okay.
That's the discretion of the chair.
Further in that section is the Women's Caucus and the Rural Caucus. You know, how exactly will this impact, because these are not one-time, you know, occurrences like the Chamber of Commerce meetings. These are ongoing meetings that we have down here.
Right. That's a conversation that we've taken a look at that several times. I think there's an argument that if the entire House is invited to the Rural Caucus, that might qualify under the exemption beginning in subsection D, line 62 to 69. I think I think that may operate and may be within that exception. I haven't convinced myself of that completely yet, to be honest with you. But what I will tell you is that we would be concerned about the potential abuse about caucuses popping up here and there. I'm not denying the validity of the Women's Caucus, the Rural Caucus, certainly the Black Caucus. But we'd want to make sure that we try to define it as best we can.
Okay. Two more questions, if you
But
don't
that's
mind.
something that we can continue to look at as we go further, for sure.
And I just, I'm flipping over to line 230, and I just want to make sure that I understand that the fee for lobbyist is $25 for every lobbyist?
Correct.
Okay. And then my last question, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence,
not at all.
is on line 275, and I know that you're probably going to know what I'm going to ask, is how exactly are we going to monitor 5 days of lobbying down here, especially since some of the lobbying efforts are going to be focused around a specific bill, right?
Well, the direct answer to your question is I don't think we have that responsibility. I think certainly there's responsibility on the part of the individual. I think over the course of time, as we've gone on over the course of time, we've had individuals here, knowingly or unknowingly, who should have registered and they haven't registered. They're lobbying on behalf of an organization, a group, entity, whatever we want to call it, but they have not registered. This would compel them to go ahead and register. If they don't register, that becomes a potential issue for them individually with the Ethics Commission.
Okay, my last question, back to the fees.
My
Yeah.
sense of it is, to me answer that a little more directly,
Yeah.
my sense of it is that other lobbyists will be patrolling that a lot more than we will.
Okay. Well, I recognize that we're not going to be down here monitoring them, and perhaps I framed my question wrong.
No, not at all.
But my intention was the monitoring aspect of 5 days. It seems like,
Let me speak to, I appreciate your bringing, let me speak to 5 days. I asked myself the question, is that an arbitrary number? And the answer is, yes, it is an arbitrary number. But of course, we decide those numbers of days in so many laws that we pass. And the question was, number one was the Nurses' Day type of example. We certainly do not want to capture that. What was the number of days so that if people wanted, if they were part of a group, wanted to represent a group, it could be the Cobb County Chamber of Commerce. There could be individuals, coming in and saying an important issue to them specifically on a particular year. They were here more than their usual one day. Well, how many days? 2 days, 3 days? There are committee meetings, there are floor sessions. 5, which of course is a business week, seemed to be a day that was reasonably long enough so that individuals who really shouldn't be caught up in the the definition of lobbyist wouldn't be, but long enough so they can be impactful on behalf of an organization. Let me say this, though. Inasmuch as those individuals may come down and represent themselves as part of a group, they can also represent themselves as individuals. And a large part of this, and I'm the first one to admit it, a large part of this really comes down to how an individual represents themselves to you and to me and to other members as they seek to influence the actions of a public officer. And if anything, we want to err on the side of flexibility, and that if an individual is coming down here and they can be saying, I'm representing a group, if they're representing a group, they are saying that to do what? To let you know that there's a group of people, they represent a lot of people, and you better listen. What is that? Trying to influence the actions of a public officer. There's nothing wrong with that. Just register. But if they're saying coming down here, it could be every day. They could come down every day and talk to a committee and testify at a committee, or be outside on the rope line at the chamber and express an opinion they're expressing for themselves, and they never have to register. Not now or after this bill goes into effect, because they're expressing themselves as individuals pursuant to their constitutional rights.
my last question. Thank you. The fee reduction from $300 to $25, that's a substantial reduction in I'm sure you've considered the fiscal impacts as it relates to this potential number.
We have. We don't have a hard number on it. I'm going to guesstimate about $250,000. Ms. LaBerge from the Ethics Commission or Transparency Commission could probably give a better number at a future time. But, I think what matters here, and that goes, of course, goes to the general fund. Those are not dedicated monies to the commission. It all goes to the general fund. And we don't minimize that in tight budget times, for certainly. But I think the imperative behind what we're trying to do in terms of having a level playing field with lobbyists, but making sure that we don't have any de facto unintended consequences as it relates to the fees in any way chilling free speech, that far outweighs the $250,000 or whatever it might be in the fees that'll come in the door, that were coming in the door. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Abrams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You addressed a few of the concerns that I had, but I would like to just sort of illuminate a couple of issues that Representative Drenner raised. Again, looking at lines 64 through 69, the exclusion of the issue-specific caucuses that we have in this body, I think they serve a very vital purpose, are generally bipartisan in nature, and would recommend that we think about possibly, and I understand the concern about creating sort of an exception that it consumes the entire rule.
Right.
And so I would recommend that we consider either grandfathering in those caucuses that have a long-standing history. It's sort of you got here in time to be included, and we include those because I do think they have served a very vital purpose, particularly the Women's Caucus, the Black Caucus, by illuminating issues and bringing together our bodies to discuss issues, and because they actually tend to cross chambers. And so I would argue that that's an important function that these caucuses serve, and that grandfathering in and identifying them specifically could be a way to limit but still recognize the vital functions that they serve.
I agree, or we could, and just by way of discussion prior to full committee next week, or we could look at it in terms of perhaps approval by a standing committee, whether it's rules or ethics or whatever it may be, or some sort of mechanism. Right. But I don't disagree with what the lady's saying at all.
Thank you. The second issue I would have also goes to something that Representative Drenner raised, lines 277 through 279. The 5 days in the calendar year, the concern it raises for me is that we have two sort of 40-day sessions. We have the 40 days when the General Assembly is in session, and then we have the 40 days that the governor has to consider legislation. And so by limiting this to a 5-day calendar year period, instead of identifying those two very specific targeted periods that we've carved out in the operation of the bodies, I would wonder whether it makes sense to constrain the 5 days to the legislative session and then have a separate set of dates for the period that immediately follows the close of the session but precedes the governor's signature on legislation, because I think those are two very distinct periods. And then you have the rest of the calendar year, which tends to have, I think, a lower threshold for operation and for people coming down here. But I wouldn't want to forestall the ability of a group to come down and successfully lobby for something and then to face the possibility that they're now forestalled from actually speaking to the governor on the same issue because of how because of the coverage of this bill.
Let me address that in two ways. The first is that there is something of relief because we are talking about the state capitol, the building we're in now, and other state government facilities within that clause. I mean, within that subsection. So outside of this, it doesn't preclude that communication or lobbying, for more than outside of that, certainly. But the gentlelady's second point was?
Well, my point is that the second floor becomes the locus of lobbying. So the state capitol exclusion.
But there's also, and I'm not arguing in any way with the lady. I understand her point, but there's also, and I go back to a point I made to Ms. Drenner, and that is that that we are also talking about individual lobbying. An individual in that situation, they could be lobbying for the Chamber of Commerce, but they also can be expressing their personal opinion. And sometimes those are one and the same. A lot of it, I will grant you, is an eye of the beholder, some of it anyway, is an eye of the beholder determination. And so therefore, if they are representing themselves hypothetically and saying they believe in this issue for themselves, not necessarily for the Cobb County whatever or the DeKalb County, whatever organization, I would argue that exempts them out because of the personal exemption. Just something to think about.
And I understand. I guess my pushback would be simply the 5 days, and I understand the constraint placed on the number of days in the eye of the beholder, but the goal is to say that there are some who don't meet the threshold of being active lobbyists. But by the same token, if they have the sort of miracle of success during the legislative session, they then have to follow that same bill when it gets to the governor's desk, and that's just a very different it's just a very different process.
It
And
is.
so my concern would be, and
Sorry.
again, if we could just consider whether or not we need to delineate the distinction between the legislative session and that time period that exists, because it's actually in our Constitution. So I want to make certain that we are giving an opportunity for people to engage and not to find themselves trapped because they didn't realize that they can't come back without going through a process that they just weren't planning to be involved in.
Point well taken. The only thing I'd say is that if in fact they would want to continue beyond the 5 days, as you know, beyond the 5 days and registering, of course they wouldn't. That could be a temporary condition. In other words, at that point, it could be through the 40-day period of the governor maybe considering a bill, and then at that point, they may want to suspend their registration. But I don't minimize what the lady's saying at all, and it's something we should consider before a full committee, for sure. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Smyron.
Mr. Chairman, I think that one thing I want to, before I ask my questions, clear up the first issue you talked about as it relates to the issue of freedom of speech and not abridge anybody's right to come down and lobby. And I'm glad that kind of was a contentious issue. I'm glad we kind of cleared that up, that in no way it was intent to try to have anybody's rights or anybody's intention known as it relates to lobbying or coming here to lobby on behalf of an organization or issue. So I'm glad we got that cleared up. And on another issue, following up on Representative Drenner and Leader Abrams is the part dealing with, we've been discussing this issue for a long time, and is how we deal with our internal apparatus, so to speak. And I'm glad we added delegations, because delegations are what I consider a legitimate apparatus or a legitimate process of the General Assembly. And when we talked about this over the last couple of months, the areas that a lot of people I've been hearing from, and some of the caucuses that were established, and I wish there was some sort of methodology or some sort of internal process where we could, as a General Assembly, could determine, I don't want to use the words legitimacy, but the credibility of these organizations that are formed, such as Rural, Family Caucus, Legislative Black, or whatever the caucus is, that they could be, we could look at that as we continue to try to perfect and draft this legislation. I've heard from a lot of members on that issue. Some of it is education. Some of it is, in some instance, is influence during the process of perfecting legislation, and I even had to go to one today, and didn't have to, but I did, just to talk about the ethics legislation, and they asked me if I would continue to speak out on that issue. So that's something that I hope is a working process, because in adding the delegation, I've heard already that's something that people thought should be added, because it is quote unquote a legitimate process as it relates to these delegations, because even delegations have to have rules to abide themselves by, in accordance with the structure of our House rules. So delegations are important. They have an important function as it relates to legislation. So I'm glad we added them. But at the same time, I hope we would consider the others, and if it was some way that we could have some mechanism or some sort of criteria that they would have to be met in order for them to come to come under this law, then I think that's something we ought to look at. And I'm glad we're not dismissing it, and I'm glad we're still discussing it. The other matter is the issue dealing with lines in the old bill, and I'm glad is that replaced as it relates to educational institutions, nonprofits? Is that replaced, or is that just deleted?
It's consolidated.
Consolidated.
There were two long provisions that we decided to put into one section that have the effect of both sections. It's really just a consolidation of language, more than anything else, and it relates to delineating on the travel lodging registration for educational, informational meetings, functions, conferences, really off-site meetings that generally occur once a year, if at all, and then delineating between travel cost and then food and beverage cost.
Would you define for me that nonprofit? What and is that? What we talking about?
Oh yeah. I don't. As I've heard someone say, we took that. I think we're not delineating between for-profit or nonprofit. It's whatever conference, whatever meeting may occur, whether it's for-profit or not for-profit.
Okay.
Let me just glance over to council to make sure I'm saying that correct.
I thought when we had our last discussion, when we dealt with that we thought that we would kind of err on the side of taking it out and we were going to delete it. I don't see it in the same section of the new draft, so I didn't know whether it was moved to another definition or whether.
Let me tell you the motivation. The motivation really was we got some feedback specifically from the Chamber of Commerce about how if we were going to have this, if we were going to have the ability for members to attend functions on the not-for-profit, they simply wanted to have a level playing field so that if Company X had some sort of informational meeting or conference, let's say out of the nuclear reactor, facility at the new construction, and they wanted to have an extended meeting or an overnight or whatever to show members what was going on, especially in light of the cost issues that are going on right now. As one example, they wanted to be on the same playing field as a not-for-profit, and in the interest of parity, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And the last thing, I didn't give you a chance to respond, but on line 62 to 66, can we just continue to have some dialogue on
Absolutely.
that? Okay.
I mean, it's a fair. I've heard that kind of feedback from a diverse range of members, from bipartisan, from all over the state, and that is a concern. And I know the author is going to very seriously consider some sort of mechanism for that, if it's possible, while maintaining the integrity of the intent. Mr. Lindsay.
Yeah, just a couple of points, in terms for the committee, in terms of where we are right now, and certainly we need to continue the discussion regarding caucuses. The problem is the creation of a slippery slope. We decided that to try to look at those entities that are already recognized in the rules. The minority caucus and the majority caucus are already recognized in our rules. Then we looked at those entities that are responsible for moving legislation, hence the reason, obviously, for the committees. And also the local delegations, which are, of course, responsible for moving local legislation. And we stopped at that point, quite frankly, to allow the discussion to continue. Because out of the concern that once you start getting into caucuses, you start trying to figure out, well, what is a legitimate caucus and what is not a legitimate caucus. Quite frankly, we felt that was a discussion that this subcommittee and the full committee ought to continue, because it is a potential slippery slope. In regards to the issue of taking out the nonprofit, just to sort of let y'all know, nonprofit takes on a lot of different meanings. Largest employer, I believe, the three largest employers, I believe, in my district are all nonprofits. They're all hospitals. They're all nonprofits. Very, very ongoing enterprises all. So we, instead of trying to delineate between the type of entity conducting the meeting or conducting the function, we instead focused on what was being conducted, or what was happening at the meeting, i.e. educational purposes, that sort of thing. Sort of focused on the activity rather than who was conducting the activity. We felt that was the best way to try to go and regulate, just to sort of give you all an idea of where we were trying to go.
Mr. Smeyer, did you have?
I do agree with you.
Did you have a response?
We need to continue to look on that caucus issue. I do agree with you.
Would if we were drafting something that deals with criteria, would would you consider, say, if the organization that was formed as a caucus was made up only of House members? I mean, in other words, if say the Rural Caucus or what, you know, just because some of the caucuses have legislators and non-legislators.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And so,
Like I said, I think this is a discussion we ought to
Okay.
continue.
Yeah.
All
And I
right.
agree with you. I'm just sort of telling you where we got to where we are now.
yeah. Well, that's my point too about the nonprofits.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nonprofits can.
Can be just about anything.
Yeah. Yeah. But I was, you know, I wasn't looking at those nonprofits. I was looking at some slower down.
We'll
down the
definitely
loop.
dialogue on the caucus issue just to make sure we've hopefully got consensus on it. Ms. Abrams, and then I'll ask for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The other change or suggestion I would make is on line 300. This section specifies industry or business expert, but there are subject matter experts that may not necessarily reflect an industry or a business.
Okay.
So would just recommend that we include that language, which would create a space for example, I know we've had discussions in the past where we've had doctors come in. They may not necessarily represent an industry, but they are a subject matter expert on the issue at hand and could be brought in by a lobbyist for that purpose.
And, I want to say that could be included or in one of the other sections, but in potentially 2 or 3, but it certainly would not hurt to add that language in 3.1. That's for sure. And if the lady would like to offer that in the nature of an amendment after a motion, I think that'd be welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. That's all the questions I see. In the interest of time, there's a DOT meet. This 143 coming up after will not take long at all. There's a DOT meeting beginning supposedly in 10 minutes. So with that, I want to thank the subcommittee for its work. The dialogue and the work continues. We will continue to receive feedback on this draft, not just from ourselves and fellow members, but certainly from members of the public at large, and that is as it should be. And once again, we're going to listen, we're going to learn, and then hopefully lead after that. And I want to thank the author who I think has been very receptive to the constructive comments that we received both during the hearing last week and after. And I think a strong bill, like I said before, has become stronger, and my sense is that trend will continue as we go on. So with that, the chair would ask for a motion, if he can get one. Move to pass by the majority whip. Is there a second? Second by Chairman Ramsey. This is a move due pass of House Bill 142 by substitute, LC 256167S. Are there any amendments, Ms. Abrams?
I think, yeah. On line 300, after the word industry, I move that we insert comma, subject matter, so that the line would read any industry, comma, subject matter, or business expert. And the purpose, again, would be to include those who may not necessarily directly represent an industry, but if you read that in concert with line 304, if there's an association that brings forward a subject matter expert, this would allow that person to appear before this body.
Any objection to the amendment? Do any members need clarification on the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? Without objection, the amendment is adopted. Let me go ahead and offer another amendment, and I'll explain it in just a second. This is, you have it printed in front of you, AM 251300. This is a good example of when you're looking at a bill like this, of how you think you've got it covered, and then all of a sudden you realize that maybe there's a scenario that you don't. Look on line page 279, and this goes to the 5-day exception that we talked about earlier. You could have a scenario whereby someone is retained on an extremely limited basis for compensation for less than 5 days to perform a very specific lobbying function and then to recede after that. And so what we seek to do with this amendment is to make sure that we capture that individual within the definition of lobbyist, and that person needs to go ahead and register. And so it would provide, at the end of line 279, simply provided that such person is not compensated specifically for lobbying. And thereby we protect the individual who is the volunteer for less than 5 days that we've talked about already. But that individual who is 5 days or less and is compensated is compelled to register. I will tell you this amendment does have the backing and support of the author. Any discussion on the amendment? Any discussion? Let me just go ahead. All in favor of the amendment AM 25-1300, please signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have the amendments adopted. Are there any further amendments? Seeing none, the question occurs on the motion by Mr. Lindsay of due pass by substitute of House Bill 142 LC 256167 as a we'll say, Mr. Allen, we're going to say, or is he here? Mr. Raleigh, we're going to just say by substitute in general as opposed to by substitute as amendment. All in favor of the gentleman's motion signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it and the motion is adopted. Let me quickly get over to House Bill 143. This is the campaign finance bill. There have been very few changes in this. One change that I think the only change that we have, if I recall correctly, is on line 123, and it's more administrative than anything else. We strike the requirement, the election year campaign disclosure. Oh, thank you. The bill is being distributed. Thank you. Thank you. I had my copy. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'll give it a second. On line 123, while that's being distributed, let me just reiterate something I said before. On House Bill 142, the full committee will not meet until next week. It's the earnest hope of the author and the subcommittee, and the full committee, frankly, and I think Chairman Meadows would agree that after this is now passed, to take a few days, step back and assess it. We've already heard about a couple of issues that have come up, one of which, of course, including the caucus issue that was brought up by Ms. Abrams, Ms. Renner, and Mr. Smyrie that we'll certainly continue to dialogue on. But if there is any general feedback or constructive suggestions about how to make what we believe is a very strong bill even stronger, I hope that folks in general will not hesitate to do so. So I just want to make sure that was clear, yet again. On House Bill 143, which is the campaign finance piece, the change, I don't know if it's significant, but it's more administrative. This is on line 123. We strike the requirement for the March 31 disclosure, election year disclosure. Why? Because the new language, which Speaker Alston recommends, of course, is to have disclosure of any funds that are raised between January 1 and the beginning of the legislative session, which to this point have not been disclosed until later on. Since those funds will already be, since the new language dictates that those funds will already be disclosed, X number, I think 5 days, right, within 5 business days of the convening of the General Assembly, that March 31 disclosure becomes duplicative because the General Assembly will generally be in session during that time. There will be no monies raised, and therefore there's nothing to disclose. In the past several years, we've gone until the end of March, sometimes into April, sometimes into the middle of April. So the March 31 disclosure becomes duplicative. That's really more of an administrative note than anything else. The big piece on that has to do with the disclosure of campaign funds between January 1 and the second Monday in January when we convene. Other than that, I just want to make sure I'm clear with Mr. Riley. I think we still maintain for our local officials the 3 levels of disclosure in order to make it a little administratively easier for them to disclose. We have less than 2,500 has certain requirements, then 2,500 to 5,000 has certain requirements, and then over 5,000 has the regular reporting requirements. And with that, I'll try to answer any questions if there are any. Ms. Abrams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I haven't made it all the way through the bill. The issue raised by GMA at the last hearing regarding an amnesty opportunity for those who have not been in compliance on the local level but have tried to become in compliance, did we address that in this version?
Not in this bill, not yet. I think that I think that the proper path would probably be to dialogue with the commission at the appropriate time to see what will administratively and legally work in that context, since we're talking about instances that have already occurred. I have heard an argument that the commission has the ability right now to waive certain fees and fines. I've heard arguments that they don't. I think a sit-down conversation is probably time well spent just to make sure we can plow through that.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Are there any further questions on the substitute to House Bill 143? Mr. Smyrie, Chairman Smyrie moves due pass of the substitute LC House Bill 143 LC 256162S. Is there a second? Second by the majority whip. Are there any amendments? Seeing none, any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the gentleman's motion signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. I want to thank members of the subcommittee. I want to thank the author, and I want to thank members of the public who took the time to be engaged on this issue. We're adjourned.